the city of Athens hummed with life. Sunlight poured down onto the marbled streets, casting a warm glow over the bustling marketplace. The air was filled with the sounds of merchants calling out to sell their wares, the clattering of pots and pans, and the vibrant energy of a city at its peak. Among the people who moved through the streets was one man whose presence, though quiet, carried a weight that none could ignore. Daedalus. Daedalus was known throughout Athens, and indeed across Greece, as a genius, a craftsman whose inventions bordered on the divine. His name was spoken with reverence, his works admired and coveted by kings and gods alike. Tall and imposing, with a thoughtful brow often furrowed in concentration, Daedalus moved through the world like a man carrying the burden of endless creativity. His hands, calloused from years of work, were as skilled as any artist's, but it was his mind, sharp and restless, that set him apart from any other man. He walked through the marketplace, eyes scanning the scene before him, though his thoughts were elsewhere, occupied by the latest invention he had been working on in his workshop. His mind rarely rested, constantly spinning with ideas, with new designs, new ways to reshape the world around him. That day, as Daedalus crossed the bustling agora, he was not headed toward any of his usual destinations. Today, he was going to the temple to offer his thanks to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and craft, who had blessed him with his unparalleled talents. His work had recently gained him the favor of the Athenian court, where his sculptures and machines had brought awe and wonder to those fortunate enough to see them. But despite the accolades, despite the admiration, Daedalus felt the gnawing edges of dissatisfaction creeping in. The praise of mortals no longer stirred his soul as it once had. His mind was already moving ahead of him, reaching for greater achievements, for perfection. His genius was both a gift and a curse, an unrelenting drive that kept him from ever truly resting. At the temple of Athena, high on the Acropolis, Daedalus stood alone. The towering statue of the goddess gazed down at him with eyes that seemed both kind and stern, as though watching over her favored disciple. He offered his thanks, bowing his head, but even here, in the sacred space meant for reflection and gratitude, his thoughts raced forward. It was there, in the shadow of the goddess of wisdom, that a flicker of darkness entered Daedalus's life, a darkness that would grow slowly and subtly until it consumed him entirely. The first seeds of this darkness were planted when Daedalus returned to his workshop later that afternoon. His nephew, Talos, had been working diligently in his absence, and when Daedalus entered, he was greeted by the sight of his young apprentice toiling away on a new project. Talos was a boy of great promise, bright and eager, with a mind that showed signs of brilliance not unlike Daedalus's own. But it was that brilliance that would prove to be Daedalus's undoing. Talos had been working on a design of his own, a simple tool, yet one of remarkable ingenuity. It was a saw crafted from the spine of a fish, and as Daedalus observed it, he felt a strange and unsettling emotion rising within him. At first, he could not name it, could not admit to himself that he, the great Daedalus, could be touched by something as petty as jealousy, but as he watched Talus work, as he saw the spark of invention in the boy's eyes, that emotion bloomed into something dark and bitter. "Uncle," Talus said eagerly, his voice filled with excitement. "Look what I've made. I thought of it while watching you carve the stone. The teeth of the fish's spine work just like the sharp edge of a knife, but better, faster." Daedalus looked at the tool in Talus's hand, then at the boy's face, alight with the same passion for invention that had once filled Daedalus himself. But instead of pride, all Daedalus felt was a cold, creeping fear. Talus's mind was sharp, perhaps even sharper than his own had been at that age. The thought twisted inside him, festering like a wound. "Very clever," Daedalus said, his voice tight, though he forced a smile. "You are talented, Talus, perhaps too talented." The boy didn't notice the tension in his uncle's voice, too caught up in the excitement of his discovery. But Daedalus could feel it growing inside him, the gnawing sense of inadequacy that had never plagued him before. He had always been the best, the brightest, the most gifted. To be surpassed, even by his own blood, was something he could not bear. Days passed, and the unease within Daedalus deepened. Talus continued to work in the workshop, crafting more tools, inventing more clever devices, and each time Daedalus watched him, the jealousy burned hotter. It was not just the boy's talent, it was his youth, his potential. Talos had years ahead of him, years in which he would only grow smarter, more skilled. And Daedalus, for all his genius, was no longer a young man. He began to distance himself from Talos, offering fewer words of encouragement, though the boy seemed not to notice. Talos worked diligently, oblivious to the storm brewing in Daedalus's heart. But the storm could not be contained forever. One evening, as the sun was setting and the workshop was bathed in the warm glow of twilight, Daedalus stood at the window, staring out at the city below. His mind raced, thoughts tumbling over one another like stones in a river. Talos was outside, perched on the edge of the roof, admiring the sunset, his mind no doubt wandering to his next invention. Daedalus watched him from the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. The boy's future stretched out before him, bright and limitless, and Daedalus could see only one thing: the loss of his own legacy, the end of his reign as Athens' greatest mind. The thought consumed him, and in that moment something in Daedalus snapped. He walked silently to the rooftop, his steps slow and deliberate, his mind clouded by the darkness that had taken root in his soul. Talos, unaware of his uncle's approach, remained seated at the edge, his legs dangling over the side, his face turned toward the fading sun. "Talos," Daedalus said, his voice low and steady, though it trembled with something darker. The boy turned, smiling brightly at his uncle. "Uncle, isn't it beautiful? The sunset, it's like fire in the sky." Daedalus nodded, though he scarcely saw the sunset. His eyes were fixed on the boy, on the bright, brilliant mind that would soon outshine his own, a mind that, if allowed to flourish, would eclipse him entirely. Without a word, Daedalus moved closer, his hand outstretched. The darkness inside him urged him forward, whispered in his ear, told him that this was the only way to secure his place, to preserve his genius. Talos must fall. In one swift motion, Daedalus pushed his nephew from the edge. There was a gasp, a brief, terrified sound, and then silence. Daedalus stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared down at the place where Talos had fallen. The workshop was eerily quiet, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. It was done. Talos, the boy who had once been his protege, his blood was gone. For a long moment, Daedalus stood there, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him like a suffocating shroud. The brilliance that had once defined him now felt like a curse, and the darkness that had driven him to this terrible act wrapped itself around his soul. But there would be no time to dwell on his guilt. The city of Athens was not kind to those who committed murder, especially one so beloved. Especially one so beloved as Talos. Whispers began to spread through the streets, and soon Daedalus found himself at the center of a growing storm. The eyes of the people turned toward him, and the once praised genius was now seen in a different light. There was no choice but to flee. Under the cover of night, Daedalus gathered what few possessions he could carry and slipped away from the city that had once celebrated him. He fled Athens, his heart heavy with the weight of his crime, his mind racing with fear and regret. He would leave behind everything: his name, his reputation, his home. There was only one place left to go, the island of Crete, where King Minos ruled with power and wealth. And so Daedalus crossed the sea, the darkness of his past following him like a shadow. As the boat carried him away from Athens, away from the life he had once known, Daedalus could only wonder what fate awaited him in the court of King Minos. But fate, as he would soon learn, is a labyrinth of its own. The island of Crete was unlike anything Daedalus had seen before. Where Athens had been a city of refined elegance, with its white marble buildings and orderly streets, Crete was wild, untamed, and majestic. As his ship approached the island's rocky shores, Daedalus could see the sprawling palace of Knossos perched high on a hilltop, its towering walls shimmering in the sunlight like the teeth of some great beast. Daedalus stood at the bow of the ship, his eyes fixed on the palace. He had heard tales of King Minos, a man known as much for his ambition as for his ruthlessness. The thought of serving under such a king sent a shiver through him. But what choice did he have? Athens was no longer a place he could call home. The memory of what he had done, the weight of Talos's fall, haunted him. Crete, with all its mysteries, was his only hope of survival. The ship's wooden hull groaned as it cut through the waves, and soon they were docking at the island's main port. The air here was thick with the scent of salt and the earthy fragrance of pine. The people of Crete moved with a kind of rugged grace, their skin bronzed by the sun, their eyes sharp and watchful. Daedalus felt like a stranger in a foreign land, though his reputation had preceded him. As he disembarked, he was met by a tall man dressed in rich, flowing robes. His skin was tanned, his hair cropped close to his head, and he wore a golden torch around his neck, marking him as someone of importance. "Daedalus of Athens?" the man asked, his voice low and formal. Daedalus nodded. "I am he." The man inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "King Minos has been expecting you. I am Androcles, one of his advisors. You will follow me." There was no time for questions, no pleasantries exchanged. Daedalus followed Androcles through the crowded streets of the port city, past market stalls filled with colorful fabrics, baskets of olives, and fresh fish. The people glanced at him as they passed, some with curiosity, others with wariness. He was an outsider here, a man from the mainland, and though his name carried weight, it also carried the whispers of his past. As they made their way through the city and up the winding path toward the palace, the landscape shifted. The rough edges of the port gave way to lush greenery. Vineyards stretched out across the hillsides, and olive trees lined the road. The palace itself loomed larger and larger. As they approached, a sprawling complex of red and black columns, intricate frescoes, and statues of gods and creatures Daedalus had never seen before. It was a place of both beauty and power, a reflection of its ruler. Inside the palace walls, the air was cooler, shaded by the high ceilings and wide corridors that led deep into the heart of the labyrinthine structure. Androcles led Daedalus through halls adorned with tapestries depicting the feats of gods and heroes, and finally they arrived at a set of grand bronze doors. "The king waits for you inside," Androcles said, his tone respectful but firm. "Good fortune, Daedalus." Daedalus took a breath and stepped through the doors. The throne room was vast, its walls lined with columns that reached up toward the high, vaulted ceiling. At the far end of the room, seated on a throne of gold and ivory, was King Minos. He was a formidable figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with gray, his eyes sharp and calculating. He wore a robe of deep crimson, and around his neck a chain of gold links that glittered in the torchlight. His gaze fixed on Daedalus as the inventor approached, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Finally, Minos leaned forward, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Daedalus of Athens," he said, his voice rich and commanding, "the great inventor, the master craftsman, the man who creates wonders." Daedalus bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the king's words. "I have come to offer my service, your majesty." Minos' smile widened, though there was no warmth in it. "Yes," he said, "I've heard much of your talents. Athens' loss is Crete's gain, it seems." The words, though complimentary, carried an edge of menace, as if Minos knew more of Daedalus's past than he let on. Daedalus kept his expression neutral, though inside his heart raced. Minos rose from his throne and began to walk slowly around Daedalus, his eyes appraising him like one might appraise a piece of fine marble. "You will find that Crete is a land of great opportunity for a man like yourself," he said, "but it is also a place of great responsibility. I do not tolerate failure, Daedalus, nor disloyalty." "I understand, my king," Daedalus replied, keeping his voice steady. Minos stopped in front of him, his gaze piercing. "Good. Then let us speak of your first task." The king turned and beckoned Daedalus to follow him. They moved deeper into the palace, down winding corridors and staircases that descended below the earth. The air grew cooler, and soon Daedalus could hear the faint sound of something large moving in the distance, something that breathed heavily, its presence unmistakable. They reached a heavy iron door, and with a nod from Minos, the guards flanking it pulled it open. Beyond the door was a vast underground chamber, dimly lit by flickering torches. At the center of the chamber was a pit, and from within that pit came the low, guttural growl of a creature that was both man and beast. Daedalus stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he peered over the edge of the pit. There, in the shadows, he saw it. The Minotaur. It was a monstrous creature, with the body of a man but the head of a bull, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Its massive form shifted restlessly as it paced the floor of the pit, its hooves clattering against the stone. The sight of it sent a shiver down Daedalus's spine, but he did not let his fear show. Minos stood beside him, watching the beast with a cold, calculating gaze. "This is my greatest secret," the king said quietly, "a creature born of the god's will. And my curse, it is both a symbol of my power and my greatest shame. And now, Daedalus, you will help me contain it." Daedalus turned to the king, his mind racing. "Contain it, my king." Minos nodded, his expression grim. "Yes. The Minotaur is too dangerous to be left free. It must be kept where it can do no harm, but where it also remains a reminder of the consequences of defying the gods." He gestured toward the stone walls of the chamber. "I want you to build a labyrinth, a prison so complex, so impenetrable, that not even the Minotaur could ever escape it. A place where only those I deem worthy will enter, and none will return." Daedalus's mind whirred with possibilities, but also with fear. To create such a labyrinth, to imprison such a creature, would be a monumental task. And yet, he knew that refusing the king's command would be more dangerous than the labyrinth itself. "I will begin immediately," Daedalus said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the task before him. Minos nodded, satisfied. "Good. You will have all the resources you need. But remember this, Daedalus. Failure is not an option. If you cannot build this labyrinth, then you will share the fate of those who enter it." The king's words were a warning, clear and unmistakable. With that, Daedalus was dismissed, and as he left the chamber, his mind was already racing with designs, with the architecture of a prison that could hold a monster. But beneath the surface, there was something else, a growing sense of dread, of the price he might pay for his ambition. The days that followed were a blur of work. Daedalus poured his energy into the design of the labyrinth, a complex network of twisting corridors, dead ends, and hidden traps. He labored tirelessly, his hands carving stone, his mind calculating every angle, every step. The palace was alive with the sound of construction, and the people of Crete whispered of the labyrinth that was being built beneath their feet, a prison for a creature born of divine wrath. But as the labyrinth grew, so too did Daedalus's unease. He had always been a man of invention, of creation, but now he was building something dark, something that would trap not just the Minotaur, but anyone who dared enter. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him even as he worked. The labyrinth became a reflection of his own mind, twisting, turning, lost in its own complexity. Weeks passed, and the labyrinth neared completion. The stone walls towered high, the corridors stretched deep into the earth, and soon there would be no escape for anyone trapped inside. Daedalus stood at the entrance one evening, his hands covered in dust, his heart heavy. He knew he had created something remarkable, something that would be remembered for generations. But he also knew that he had built a prison, not just for the Minotaur, but for himself. He was trapped in his own ambition, in the service of a king who demanded perfection and loyalty above all else. As Daedalus turned to leave the labyrinth, his mind filled with thoughts of what he had built, a figure appeared at the entrance. It was Androcles, the king's advisor, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "The labyrinth is nearly finished," Androcles said, his voice low. "The king will be pleased." Daedalus nodded, though his heart was not in it. "Yes, it is as the king commanded." Androcles stepped closer, his eyes sharp. "And you, Daedalus, are you pleased with what you have created?" Daedalus paused, his thoughts swirling. The labyrinth was a marvel of architecture, a testament to his skill, but it was also a symbol of something darker, a place where ambition had led him, a place where he was no longer in control. "I did what I had to do," Daedalus said quietly. Androcles smiled faintly, though it was a cold smile. "Perhaps, but remember this, Daedalus, the labyrinth has a way of trapping more than just the Minotaur. Be careful not to lose yourself inside." With those words, Androcles turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Daedalus standing alone at the entrance to the labyrinth. The air was still, the only sound the faint echo of Androcles' footsteps fading away. Daedalus stood there for a long moment, the weight of the labyrinth pressing down on him. And then, without a word, he stepped inside. The labyrinth seemed to stretch on forever, its twisting corridors swallowing Daedalus whole as he moved deeper into its depths. Every stone, every corner, every turn felt like an extension of himself, a physical manifestation of his genius and ambition. But the deeper he walked, the more he felt the labyrinth was not just a prison for the Minotaur. It had become a prison for his soul, The walls towered high above him, cold and unforgiving, lit only by flickering torches set at intervals along the path. The shadows danced across the stone, shifting like living things, and for the first time, Daedalus felt a chill run down his spine. He had spent so many weeks designing and building this labyrinth that he hadn't fully realized its true nature until now. He paused at a fork in the path, staring down two identical corridors that disappeared into darkness. Even he, the one who had created this place, felt lost. The labyrinth was perfect, so intricate, so deceptive, that even the man who had designed it couldn't navigate its depths without a sense of dread creeping into his mind. Is this what I've become? Daedalus muttered to himself, his voice echoing softly off the walls. A man who builds cages instead of wonders? The weight of what he had done hung heavy over him, and as he turned to retrace his steps back to the surface, his mind raced with thoughts of what awaited him above. King Minos had become ever more demanding in recent weeks, his visits to the labyrinth more frequent, his eyes sharper, more critical. The king wanted something monumental, something legendary, and Daedalus had delivered, but at what cost? He climbed out of the labyrinth just as the last light of day disappeared behind the horizon, casting the palace of Knossos in deep shades of purple and gold. The air outside was warm and thick, a stark contrast to the cold, lifeless stone beneath the earth. Yet even here, in the open air, Daedalus could not shake the sense of entrapment that clung to him. As he made his way back toward the palace, the halls were filled with the usual bustle of servants and courtiers, though tonight their movements seemed hurried, anxious. Whispers echoed through the corridors, but the words were hushed, guarded. Something was happening. Before he could inquire further, a figure appeared before him, Androcles, the king's advisor, his expression grim. Daedalus, Androcles said, his voice low but urgent. The king requests your presence in the throne room. Daedalus nodded, though his stomach tightened. He had sensed the growing tension in Minos for weeks now, a tightening of the king's grip over his court, over Crete. But this was something more. As he followed Androcles through the labyrinthine palace halls, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The throne room was filled with an air of unease. Minos sat upon his gilded throne, his posture rigid, his face a mask of controlled fury. Around him, courtiers stood silently, their heads bowed, their eyes darting nervously toward the king. Daedalus stepped forward, his pulse quickening. Daedalus, Minos said, his voice a low growl. You have done as I asked. The labyrinth is nearly complete, is it not? It is, my king, Daedalus replied, careful to keep his tone respectful. It will be finished within the week. Minos's eyes narrowed. Good? Then we will see if it is as impenetrable as you claim. Daedalus blinked, confused by the king's words. What do you mean, my lord? Minos rose from his throne, his dark eyes boring into Daedalus's. The time has come to test your creation, Daedalus. We will see if the labyrinth can truly contain the beast. Daedalus's heart skipped a beat. He had known, of course, that the labyrinth was meant to imprison the Minotaur, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. There was no turning back. The creature would be sent into the labyrinth, and if his design failed, it would be on his head. "Of course, my king," Daedalus said, bowing his head slightly. "It is built to your specifications. The Minotaur will never escape." Minos stepped down from his throne, his heavy footsteps echoing off the marble floor. He approached Daedalus, standing close enough that the inventor could feel the intensity of the king's gaze. "See to it that you are right," Minos said quietly, though the threat in his voice was unmistakable. "Because if it does escape, Daedalus, it will not be the only thing lost in the labyrinth." Daedalus swallowed hard, nodding. "It will not fail, my lord." Minos stared at him for a long moment, then turned his back, dismissing Daedalus with a wave of his hand. The courtiers parted as the inventor left the throne room, the murmur of voices rising behind him as he made his way back through the palace halls. The weight of the king's words hung over him as he returned to his workshop, his thoughts churning. Minos's trust in him was thin, and the slightest failure would be catastrophic. But it wasn't just the king's wrath that troubled Daedalus. It was the labyrinth itself. In building it, he had trapped more than just a monster. He had trapped himself, caught in a web of ambition, fear, and loyalty. The days passed in a blur of final adjustments and preparations. Daedalus worked tirelessly, overseeing the last touches on the labyrinth, ensuring that every detail was perfect. There could be no room for error, no chance that the Minotaur would escape. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force, suffocating and relentless. And then the day arrived. The palace was tense, its courtyards eerily silent as Minos's guards prepared to transport the Minotaur from its pit to the labyrinth. Daedalus stood at the entrance to the labyrinth, watching as the beast was led forward, its massive form straining against the chains that bound it. The creature's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its breath came in harsh, guttural bursts. Even from a distance, Daedalus could feel the raw, untamed power of the Minotaur, a power that had been created by the gods themselves. King Minos stood nearby, his face impassive as the guards struggled to keep control of the beast. Daedalus's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Everything was in place. The labyrinth would hold. The Minotaur let out a bellowing roar as the guards forced it into the entrance of the labyrinth. Daedalus watched as the creature disappeared into the twisting corridors, its heavy footfalls echoing through the stone passageways. And then the doors of the labyrinth slammed shut, sealing the beast inside. For a long moment there was silence. The entire court held its breath, waiting, listening. Finally, King Minos turned to Daedalus, his eyes cold and unreadable. "It is done." Daedalus nodded, though his heart was still racing. "The labyrinth will hold, my king. The Minotaur will never escape." Minos said nothing, only turned and walked away, his guards and courtiers following in silence. Daedalus remained at the entrance to the labyrinth, staring into the dark stone corridors, listening to the faint sounds of the Minotaur deep within. The king's words echoed in his mind. If it escapes? That night, Daedalus could not sleep. He lay awake in his chambers, his thoughts consumed by the labyrinth, by the Minotaur, by the weight of what he had done. The labyrinth was perfect. He knew it was. But still, the doubt gnawed at him. Had he missed something? Was there a flaw? Some overlooked detail that would allow the creature to escape? Unable to shake the feeling, Daedalus rose from his bed and dressed, leaving his chambers in the dead of night. The palace was silent, the corridors dark, but Daedalus knew the way by heart. He made his way through the halls, down the winding staircases that led to the labyrinth's entrance. The night air was cool against his skin as he stood before the labyrinth once more, the massive stone doors looming in the darkness. For a long time, he stood there, staring at the doors, listening to the faint sounds of the night. The island of Crete was quiet, but the silence was heavy, oppressive. And then, as he turned to leave, he heard it, a faint, distant sound coming from within the labyrinth, a low, rumbling growl. Daedalus froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The Minotaur was restless. The beast trapped in the heart of the labyrinth was stirring. But was it contained? Or was it searching for a way out? He had to know. Without thinking, Daedalus stepped toward the entrance, his hand reaching for the lever that would open the door. He hesitated, his mind racing with thoughts of the king's warning, of the danger that lay within, but the need to know, to see if his creation had truly succeeded, was overwhelming. With a deep breath, Daedalus pulled the lever. The stone doors groaned as they slowly swung open, revealing the dark, twisting corridors of the labyrinth. The air inside was cool, damp, and filled with an unsettling stillness. Daedalus stepped forward, his footsteps echoing softly off the stone walls as he ventured deeper into the labyrinth. The corridors twisted and turned around him, familiar yet disorienting. Daedalus moved cautiously, his heart racing with every step. He had built this labyrinth, had designed every inch of it, but now, as he walked through its winding passages, he felt like a stranger in his own creation. And then he heard it again. The growl, closer this time, echoing through the corridors like a distant thunderstorm. The Minotaur was near. Daedalus's pulse quickened, but still he pressed on, his feet carrying him deeper into the labyrinth toward the source of the sound. He rounded a corner, and there, in the dim torchlight, he saw it. The Minotaur stood at the far end of the corridor, its massive form casting a long shadow across the stone floor. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its breath came in heavy, labored bursts. The creature's muscles tensed as it spotted Daedalus, and for a moment they stood frozen, staring at one another. And then, with a sudden, terrifying roar, the Minotaur charged. Daedalus's heart leapt into his throat as the Minotaur hurtled toward him, its hooves thundering against the stone floor like the drums of war. His pulse raced, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. The beast's massive form barreled down the corridor, its horns gleaming in the dim torchlight, its eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. There was no mistaking the intent in its charge. Death, swift and brutal. Instinct kicked in. Without thinking, Daedalus spun on his heel and bolted down the winding passageway, his sandals slapping against the stone floor in a rapid, desperate rhythm. The air in the labyrinth felt thicker now, closing in around him, as if the very walls were conspiring with the beast to trap him. His lungs burned with each breath, and the sound of the Minotaur's approach grew louder, closer with every second. He had designed this labyrinth to disorient, to confuse, but now that very design worked against him. Every turn looked the same, stone walls, flickering torches, the distant echo of his own footsteps. He had memorized the layout, of course, but fear blurred the lines between knowledge and panic. Was this the right way, or had he just led himself into a dead end? The creature let out a bellowing roar, its breath hot and ragged, and Daedalus felt the ground tremble beneath him. The Minotaur was gaining. If he didn't find a way out soon, all of his genius, all of his skill would come to nothing. The corridor ahead split into two paths, each disappearing into darkness. Without pausing to think, Daedalus veered to the left, hoping, praying that this was the way back to the entrance. His feet pounded against the stone, his body moving on sheer willpower. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to stop, to rest, but the Minotaur's snarls pushed him forward. He couldn't stop. Not here. Not now. Suddenly, the path ahead opened up into a wide chamber. The ceiling rose high above, supported by towering columns that cast long shadows across the floor. It was a space designed for trickery, a false exit meant to lure intruders into a sense of safety. Daedalus recognized it instantly. It was one of his more elaborate traps, a room with hidden pitfalls and sliding walls that would seal itself shut, trapping any who wandered into its clutches. But for Daedalus, it was the only chance he had. He sprinted across the chamber, his eyes scanning the walls for the faint outline of the lever he had installed to trigger the trap. His hands fumbled over the cold stone, searching desperately. The sound of the Minotaur's approach echoed through the chamber, each footfall a reminder of how little time he had left. His fingers found the lever. Without hesitation, Daedalus pulled it with all his strength. The ground beneath him trembled, and with a deafening groan, the stone walls began to shift. The floor beneath his feet shuddered as hidden panels slid into place, sealing off the entrance just as the Minotaur burst into the chamber. For a moment, Daedalus thought he had succeeded. The Minotaur stood at the far end of the room, its massive body silhouetted against the stone wall, trapped behind the newly sealed barrier. But then, with a terrifying roar, the creature slammed its horns into the wall, sending cracks spidering across the stone. Daedalus backed away, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He had built the labyrinth to withstand anything, but the raw strength of the Minotaur was more than even he had anticipated. The walls shuddered with each impact, and Daedalus knew it was only a matter of time before the beast broke through. There was no other option. He had to escape before the Minotaur brought the labyrinth down around them both. He turned and bolted toward the far end of the chamber, where a narrow passageway led deeper into the labyrinth. His body ached with exhaustion, but fear pushed him forward. He could still hear the creature's roars behind him, growing more frenzied with each passing moment. The passageway twisted and turned, its walls pressing in on him as he ran. The air grew colder, more oppressive, and Daedalus felt the weight of the labyrinth bearing down on him. He had designed this place to be a prison for the Minotaur, but now it felt like a prison for him as well. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a faint light ahead. The exit. Relief flooded through him, giving him the strength to push forward. He stumbled out of the labyrinth and collapsed onto the cold stone floor, gasping for breath. The night sky stretched out above him, the stars distant and cold, indifferent to his struggles. For a long moment, Daedalus lay there, his chest heaving as he stared up at the heavens. He had survived, barely. But as he lay there, the weight of what had just happened began to settle over him. He had come face to face with the monster he had helped to imprison, and he had barely escaped with his life. The labyrinth had proven its worth, but at what cost? Daedalus could feel the growing unease within him, the knowledge that his creations, no matter how brilliant, were becoming chains that bound him to forces beyond his control. Footsteps approached, and Daedalus sat up to see Androcles standing nearby, his expression unreadable. "You're lucky to be alive," Androcles said, his voice low. Daedalus nodded, still catching his breath. "The labyrinth will hold," he said, though the words felt hollow. "The Minotaur cannot escape." Androcles' eyes flickered with something. Pity, perhaps. Or maybe it was fear. "It's not the Minotaur I'm worried about," he said quietly. Daedalus frowned, but before he could respond, Androcles turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the palace. Exhausted and shaken, Daedalus returned to his chambers. The cool air of the room did little to calm his nerves. His body still trembled from the encounter, and his mind raced with thoughts of what had just transpired. But there was no time for rest. The next day, Daedalus was summoned once more to the king's chambers. Minos was waiting for him, standing by a large window that overlooked the palace gardens. The sunlight filtered through the leaves of the olive trees, casting dappled shadows across the room. But the peaceful scene outside did nothing to soften the tension in the air. "Daedalus," Minos said without turning to face him, "the labyrinth is complete." "Yes, my king," Daedalus replied, keeping his voice steady. "It is as you requested." Minos turned then, his dark eyes locking onto Daedalus's. "And the Minotaur? It remains inside?" Daedalus nodded. "The creature is secure. It will never escape." For a moment, there was silence. Then Minos walked toward him, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "Good," he said, though his tone was hard, "because you are not finished yet." Daedalus felt his stomach tighten. "What more would you have me do, my lord?" Minos's gaze was cold, calculating. "You will build something else for me, something that will ensure Crete's dominance over the other city. States, a weapon, Daedalus, one that only you can create." Daedalus's mind raced. A weapon. He had spent his life creating marvels, wonders of art and engineering, but this was something different, something dangerous. "My king," Daedalus began carefully, "I am a craftsman, not a maker of weapons. My skills lie in creation, not destruction." Minos's eyes narrowed. "Do not mistake my request for a choice, Daedalus. You will build what I ask, or you will find yourself lost in your own labyrinth." The threat was clear. There was no refusing the king. Daedalus bowed his head, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he was about to do. "As you wish, my lord." Minos nodded, satisfied. "Good. You will begin immediately." Daedalus left the throne room, his thoughts swirling with the weight of his new task. He had built the labyrinth to contain a monster, but now he was being asked to create something even more terrible, a weapon that would bring destruction to the world. As he walked back to his workshop, his mind turned to Icarus. His son had been his only source of light in these dark days, a reminder of the innocence and joy that still existed in the world. Icarus was young, full of life and blissfully unaware of the shadow that had fallen over his father's soul. That night, Daedalus sat with Icarus by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance in the hearth. The boy chattered excitedly about his latest project, a small wooden boat he had been working on. His eyes shone with the same passion for invention that had once filled Daedalus, but now that passion felt tainted. "Icarus," Daedalus said quietly, interrupting the boy's excited rambling, "there is something I must tell you." Icarus looked up, his bright eyes full of curiosity. "What is it, father?" Daedalus hesitated. His heart heavy. He didn't want to burden his son with the weight of what was to come, but he also knew that he could not hide the truth forever. "We may have to leave Crete soon," Daedalus said carefully. "Things here are changing. The king, he is asking too much of me." Icarus frowned, his excitement fading. "Leave? But why? You've done everything the king has asked." Daedalus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sometimes, Icarus, even when you do what is asked of you, it is not enough. And sometimes what is asked of you is wrong." The boy didn't fully understand, but he nodded anyway, sensing the weight in his father's words. Where would we go? Daedalus smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Anywhere. Somewhere far from here, somewhere we can be free." Icarus's eyes lit up at the thought of adventure, but Daedalus's heart ached with the knowledge that freedom was not so easily won. As the night wore on, Daedalus sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting back to the Labyrinth, to the Minotaur, and to the weapon he was now being forced to create. The walls of the palace seemed to close in around him, trapping him in a web of his own making. And as the fire burned low, Daedalus whispered to himself the one truth he had been trying to avoid. We must escape. The sky above Crete stretched wide and clear, but for Daedalus and Icarus, the path to freedom had never seemed so distant. The walls of the palace felt like they were closing in more with each passing day, as if the very stones conspired to keep them trapped. Daedalus could feel the weight of King Minos' demands pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs, leaving him suffocated by the responsibility he could no longer bear. In the days since their conversation by the fire, Daedalus had worked feverishly on the designs for the weapon the king had ordered. Each moment he spent drafting and shaping the plans felt like another link in a chain binding him to a future he no longer wanted. He knew that once this weapon was built, it would not only cement Minos' power, but also bring devastation to the lands beyond Crete. It was a weapon of destruction, not creation, and Daedalus' soul ached at the thought of what he was about to unleash upon the world. But worse than that was the knowledge that once the weapon was complete, Minos would have no more use for him. And in the king's world, those who had outlived their usefulness were quickly forgotten, or worse. Daedalus couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let Icarus's future be stolen from him by a tyrant's whims. It was time to leave Crete behind, to flee the labyrinth of intrigue and danger that had entangled them both. One evening, as the sun sank low on the horizon, casting the palace in long shadows, Daedalus found Icarus in the small garden just outside their chambers. The boy was kneeling by the edge of a small pond, his hands gently swirling the water, lost in his own thoughts. When Daedalus approached, Icarus looked up, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the setting sun. "Father," Icarus said, standing to greet him, "you've been working so late. Have you finished the weapon for King Minos?" Daedalus shook his head, his expression grave. "No, Icarus. I will never finish it." Icarus frowned in confusion, but before he could ask, Daedalus stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're leaving," Daedalus said quietly, his voice firm. "Tonight, we cannot stay here any longer." Icarus's eyes widened with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "Leaving? But how?" "The king will never let us go." Daedalus's gaze flicked toward the sky, where the last rays of sunlight faded into dusk. "I've been working on something in secret, a way for us to escape without being seen, without having to navigate the labyrinth or the guarded walls of the palace." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "We will fly, Icarus." The boy blinked in surprise, his eyes darting to his father's face, searching for some hint that this was a jest. But Daedalus's expression was serious, his mind already focused on the task at hand. "Fly?" Icarus echoed, his voice incredulous. "But how is that possible?" Daedalus gestured for Icarus to follow him, leading the boy back to their chambers. Once inside, he pulled aside a large cloth that had been covering a hidden section of the room, revealing a pair of wings, massive, intricate structures made of wood, leather, and feathers. They were beautiful, almost otherworldly in their craftsmanship, the culmination of weeks of secret work. Icarus stared in awe at the wings, his heart racing. "You made these?" Daedalus nodded. "Yes. They're designed to mimic the wings of a bird, using the same principles of lift and balance. With these, we can soar above the sea, beyond the reach of Minos and his soldiers. No one will follow us into the skies." Icarus stepped closer, his fingers brushing against the delicate feathers. "They're amazing. But will they work?" Daedalus met his son's gaze, his eyes filled with both determination and caution. "They will. But there are risks, Icarus. You must listen carefully to what I say. The wax that holds the feathers together is strong, but it will melt if exposed to too much heat. You must not fly too close to the sun." Icarus nodded, but there was a flicker of excitement in his eyes that made Daedalus uneasy. The boy had always been eager, always filled with the desire to push beyond limits. Daedalus could see the spark of adventure in his son, but this was not a time for recklessness. "Promise me, Icarus," Daedalus said, his voice firm. "Promise that you will stay close to me and that you will not fly too high. The sky is a dangerous place, and if you stray too far, you may never return." Icarus nodded again, more seriously this time. "I promise, Father." That night, under the cover of darkness, Daedalus and Icarus slipped away from the palace. The wings, folded and strapped to their backs, felt light and strong, ready to carry them far from Crete's shores. The air was cool, and the stars above shimmered like distant beacons, guiding their way. As they reached the cliffside overlooking the sea, Daedalus paused, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, their only chance at freedom. He looked at Icarus, who was watching the horizon with wide eyes, his face alight with the thrill of what was to come. "Are you ready?" Daedalus asked, his voice soft but filled with urgency. Icarus smiled, the excitement clear on his face. "I'm ready." With one last glance at the palace that had been their prison, Daedalus took a deep breath and leapt into the air, his wings unfurling as the wind caught beneath them. For a moment he felt weightless, as if the chains that had bound him for so long had been broken. The air rushed past him, cool and clean, and the ground below fell away as he soared higher. Icarus followed, his laughter ringing out into the night as he, too, took flight. The boy's joy was infectious, and for a brief moment, all of Daedalus's fears melted away. They were free, free from Minos, free from the Labyrinth, free from the weight of their past. The moonlight reflected off the sea below, turning the water into a shimmering sheet of silver. Daedalus kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, his mind focused on the path ahead. They would fly toward the islands, far beyond the reach of Crete, to a place where they could start anew. But as they flew, Daedalus noticed something that made his heart clench with fear. Icarus, caught up in the thrill of flight, was beginning to ascend, climbing higher and higher into the sky. "Icarus!" Daedalus called out, his voice carried away by the wind. "Stay close to me. Remember what I told you." But Icarus didn't hear him, or if he did, he ignored the warning. His laughter echoed through the night as he soared upward, the thrill of freedom overwhelming his sense of caution. The air grew warmer as he climbed, and Daedalus's heart raced with dread. "Icarus! No!" Daedalus shouted, his voice desperate. But it was too late. The boy flew higher still, his wings cutting through the thin, warm air as he approached the realm of the gods. And then, as Daedalus had feared, the wax holding the feathers together began to melt. Icarus's laughter turned to cries of fear as the wings faltered, the feathers falling away one by one. His arms flailed as he tried to stay aloft, but the wings were disintegrating, the heat of the sun claiming him. "Father!" Icarus screamed, his voice filled with terror as he began to plummet toward the sea below. Daedalus's heart shattered as he watched his son fall, helpless to save him. He dived after Icarus, his wings beating frantically against the air, but the distance between them grew too great. He could only watch as Icarus's body disappeared into the waves, the sea swallowing him whole. For a long moment, Daedalus hovered there in the sky, his body trembling with grief and despair. The sky that had once promised freedom now felt like a cruel, empty expanse. He had flown too close to his own ambition, and now he had lost the one thing that mattered most. Finally, with tears streaming down his face, Daedalus descended toward the sea. He searched the waters below for any sign of Icarus, but the waves had already claimed him, leaving only silence in their wake. Daedalus landed on a nearby island, his legs weak and his heart broken. The wings that had once felt so light now weighed heavily on his back, a reminder of his failure. He collapsed onto the sand, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the grief overtook him. He had escaped Minos, he had escaped the Labyrinth, but in doing so, he had lost his son. The night stretched on, the stars cold and distant above him, indifferent to his pain. Daedalus lay there alone, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, the only answer to his cries. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Daedalus whispered the only word left in his shattered heart. "Icarus." The end.